Long before their final days appeared in textbooks and timelines, two vast empires stood so powerful that even imagining their disappearance felt strange, like picturing mountains politely stepping aside for rivers that had always obeyed their paths. If strength, armies, and laws were enough to last forever, history would be very quiet indeed, yet this story invites us to wonder why greatness so often carries hidden cracks beneath polished stone and carefully painted banners. As we begin this journey together, consider how safety can slowly turn into confidence, confidence into habit, and habit into blindness, especially when rulers believe tomorrow will behave exactly like yesterday, despite quiet warnings whispered across borders and marketplaces. In both empires, roads stretched far, messengers traveled quickly, and coins changed hands daily, which made power feel solid and dependable, even while distant corners grew restless, sensing that order from the capital no longer understood their changing lives. The first empire ruled with laws written carefully and enforced proudly, while the second trusted tradition, ritual, and inherited authority, creating two different styles of control that appeared strong yet relied heavily on people continuing to believe in them. At their centers, cities glittered with monuments and ceremonies, giving citizens a comforting sense that the world was balanced, while beyond the walls, farmers, traders, and soldiers faced problems that were rarely discussed in elegant halls. Early signs of tension appeared not as loud disasters, but as small disagreements, rising taxes, delayed payments to troops, and arguments over who truly deserved power, all of which felt manageable until they quietly multiplied. The storyteller guiding you today walks between these empires as they still stand tall, noticing how leaders focus on defending borders while struggling to notice changes inside their own systems, where loyalty slowly becomes conditional rather than automatic. In the first empire, expansion had once solved problems by bringing new resources, yet growth now demanded constant effort, stretching armies thin and turning victory into a tiring routine rather than a joyful triumph. Meanwhile, the Second Empire relied on ancient customs that had guided generations, though new challenges required flexible thinking, creating a quiet clash between honoring the past and surviving the present without upsetting powerful families. Daily life continued, with markets opening at sunrise and children learning familiar stories, yet rumors traveled just as fast as goods, carrying doubts about whether rulers truly understood the lives of ordinary people anymore. Powerful officials in both realms began competing with one another, believing personal success mattered more than cooperation, which weakened trust at the very moment unity was most urgently needed. Military strength remained impressive on paper, but soldiers increasingly came from distant regions, serving for pay rather than loyalty, which subtly changed how quickly they would respond to crises. As decades passed, victories felt less satisfying because each triumph required more effort and produced fewer lasting results, leaving leaders proud yet strangely exhausted by their own success. Trade routes still functioned, though disruptions from bandits, local conflicts, and shifting alliances reminded merchants that stability depended on constant attention rather than old reputations. In the halls of power, advisors debated solutions, often proposing harsher rules or higher taxes, believing control could be tightened like a knot without realizing that knots pulled too hard eventually snap. Religious beliefs and philosophies, once unifying forces, began inspiring different interpretations, offering comfort to some while quietly challenging authority for others. The storyteller pauses here to observe how both empires believed disorder always came from outside enemies, rarely suspecting that long-term habits might weaken structures more effectively than invading armies. Environmental changes also played their part, as droughts, floods, or changing climates reduced harvests, forcing governments to react quickly or risk losing the trust of those who depended on them for protection. Messages from frontier regions grew more urgent, describing unrest and fear, yet officials sometimes softened these reports, hoping problems would solve themselves before reaching the center. Education in both empires celebrated past heroes and glorious victories, which inspired pride but subtly discouraged questioning current decisions that no longer matched old circumstances. Generals requested reinforcements, governors requested resources, and treasurers warned of shortages, creating a triangle of demands that could no longer be satisfied simultaneously. In the First Empire, citizenship once granted privilege and responsibility, though over time it became diluted, weakening the emotional bond that made people willing to sacrifice for the state. The Second Empire faced a different challenge, as succession disputes quietly prepared future conflicts, reminding everyone that stability depended heavily on the character of a few individuals. Ordinary people adapted as they always had, adjusting routines and hopes, though their patience gradually wore thin when promises failed to turn into visible improvements. Foreign neighbors observed carefully, noticing hesitation where confidence once ruled, and began testing boundaries through trade pressure, diplomacy, or subtle military actions. What had once been quick responses to danger now required long discussions, approvals, and delays, allowing small problems to grow into serious threats before action arrived. Cultural pride remained strong, expressed through art, architecture, and festivals. Yet beneath celebration lived uncertainty about whether traditions alone could protect the future. Taxes increased again, justified by defense and administration costs, though citizens wondered why protection felt weaker despite paying more each year. The storyteller notes gently how fear changes priorities, pushing leaders to preserve appearances rather than admit vulnerabilities that might invite reform. Overconfidence from centuries of success may decline, difficult to recognize, as history's longest shadows often hide the coming sunset rather than announce it loudly. Alliances within each empire became more fragile as trust required constant reinforcement, and any sign of weakness encouraged opportunism instead of cooperation. Internal migration altered cities and towns, bringing cultural mixing that enriched daily life but challenged rigid systems designed for earlier, simpler patterns. Military drills continued, banners flew proudly, yet coordination between units suffered as resources dwindled and communication slowed under bureaucratic weight. Judges struggled to enforce laws evenly, balancing fairness against pressure from powerful families, which quietly damaged belief in justice as a shared foundation. In borderlands, local leaders sometimes took control into their own hands, believing immediate action mattered more than distant approval, which further loosened central authority. The First Empire tried to standardize solutions across regions, ignoring local realities, while the Second relied heavily on personal relationships that varied unpredictably. Stories of past collapses existed in both cultures, told as distant warnings, though many listeners assumed such endings belonged safely in history rather than the present. Economic inequality grew more visible, creating divisions between those protected by power and those carrying its burdens without influence. Public ceremonies still declared strength and continuity, though some attendees noticed enthusiasm fading into obligation rather than genuine belief. Administrative reforms were attempted, yet resistance from entrenched interests slowed meaningful change, turning adaptation into a frustrating process. The storyteller reflects how systems built for stability sometimes resist survival when conditions change faster than institutions can respond. External pressures increase gradually, not through dramatic invasions, but through constant testing that drained attention and resources. Leadership turnover brought new faces, but often familiar thinking, maintaining continuity without addressing emerging realities. Citizens sought meaning in local communities, faith, or trade networks, quietly shifting loyalty away from distant capitals. In the First Empire, borders once defined confidence now felt like fragile lines requiring constant defense. In the Second Empire, sacred traditions maintained order, though their rigidity limited creative responses to unfamiliar challenges. Education of future leaders emphasized obedience and respect, while innovation struggled to find space within established hierarchies. Military spending dominated budgets, leaving less for infrastructure, welfare, and innovation, which subtly undermined long-term strength. As challenges layered upon one another, decision-making slowed, with leaders fearing mistakes more than inaction. The storyteller pauses, sensing that neither empire yet understands how close history has brought them to a turning point shaped not by one event, but by many choices accumulating quietly. As pressures tightened, moments that once felt minor began overlapping, so decisions made for convenience created consequences elsewhere, revealing how interconnected systems react when flexibility disappears and every adjustment pulls painfully on another fragile thread. In the First Empire, frontier commanders adapted on their own, striking deals or retreating strategically, yet these independent actions unsettled central authorities who feared losing control more than losing territory. The Second Empire watched internal rivalries intensify as noble families competed for influence, believing survival depended on proximity to power rather than loyalty to a shared future. When military defeats finally occurred, they shocked populations accustomed to victory because failure challenged stories repeated for generations about destiny, protection, and the belief that collapse happened only to others. Economic disruptions followed swiftly since trade relies on confidence as much as safety, and merchants hesitated when roads felt uncertain and promises from officials sounded rehearsed rather than convincing. The storyteller guides us through markets where prices fluctuate wildly, not from sudden greed, but from fear that tomorrow's roles may change without warning or fairness. Refugees from troubled regions arrived in cities, bringing skills, stories, and anxiety, which enriched culture while straining resources already stretched thin by years of cautious governance. Military leaders argued for stronger responses, though funding and manpower could no longer match ambition, forcing compromises that satisfied no one fully. In the First Empire, reliance on foreign soldiers increased, creating a force effective in battle yet detached from the emotional stakes of preserving imperial ideals. Meanwhile, the Second Empire struggled to enforce authority uniformly as distant governors balanced obedience with practicality, sometimes choosing peace over rigid loyalty. Public trust weakened quietly because when institutions failed to respond consistently, people learned to rely on personal networks rather than shared systems. Natural disasters struck at inconvenient moments, magnifying existing weaknesses, since recovery demanded coordination that bureaucratic inertia delayed. The storyteller observes how leaders still debated symbols of unity while citizens cared more about safety, food, and fairness than ceremonial displays. In the First Empire, taxation reached limits that sparked resentment, especially when protection felt unreliable and explanations sounded increasingly abstract. The Second Empire faced spiritual uncertainty as religious authority fractured, offering comfort while also questioning the legitimacy of those in power. External enemies sensed opportunity, pushing boundaries more boldly, discovering that response times had slowed and internal debates often prevented decisive action. Military victories became temporary relief rather than solutions, postponing difficult reforms instead of addressing underlying instability. Education systems continued praising tradition, which preserved identity but discouraged confronting realities that demanded uncomfortable change. As loyalty declined, law enforcement depended more on force than trust, making order more visible but less resilient. The storyteller notes that fear of disorder often produces strict control, even though such control accelerates alienation rather than preventing it. In both empires, communication between center and periphery suffered as messages were filtered to avoid blame, distorting understanding until leaders reacted too late. When reforms were finally attempted, they arrived simultaneously and abruptly, overwhelming administrators and confusing citizens who struggled to adapt. The First Empire's infrastructure, once its pride, deteriorated under insufficient maintenance, making movement slower and reinforcing isolation between regions. The Second Empire experienced symbolic fractures when sacred rituals failed to inspire unity, revealing how belief cannot be commanded, only nurtured. Military morale declined as soldiers sensed uncertainty among commanders, affecting discipline despite continued professionalism. Economic inequality hardened into resentment since wealth concentrated among elites appeared disconnected from responsibility or sacrifice. The storyteller walks through palaces where advisors argued fiercely, each convinced their solution alone could restore stability, though cooperation remained elusive. Repeated crises normalized emergency thinking, reducing long-term planning and encouraging short-term fixes that compounded future problems. Local leaders gained popularity by offering immediate protection, subtly shifting allegiance away from imperial authority. Cultural diversity flourished in cities, yet central policies failed to accommodate it effectively, creating tension between inclusion and control. In the First Empire, legal complexity grew unmanageable, making justice expensive and slow, undermining respect for institutions. The Second Empire faced succession uncertainty again, reminding citizens that continuity depended precariously on individual lives. Military borders shifted inward, not dramatically, but persistently, changing maps through accumulation rather than collapse. Trade alliances dissolved quietly as partners sought stability elsewhere, weakening economic resilience. Public ceremonies continued, though attendance became habit rather than heartfelt participation. The storyteller reflects how denial often wears ceremonial clothing, appearing dignified while avoiding honest assessment. Natural resources dwindled under mismanagement, turning abundance into scarcity and cooperation into competition. Internal rebellions emerged sporadically, not always ideological, but rooted in frustration and survival instincts. Responses to unrest grew harsher, increasing cycles of resistance and repression that drained energy from rebuilding trust. The First Empire's identity blurred as citizenship lost meaning amid expanding borders and diluted responsibilities. The Second Empire's sacred authority weakened when contradictions between teachings and actions became harder to ignore. Military expenditures soared while effectiveness declined, revealing imbalance between investment and outcome. The storyteller guides us through moments when leaders faced choices between compromise and force, often choosing the latter when patience felt risky. Crisis management replaced vision, transforming governance into reaction rather than guidance. Communities strengthened local bonds, preparing for uncertainty by relying on each other rather than distant promises. External invasions finally struck with momentum, encountering defenses weakened by internal distraction. In both empires, collapse unfolded unevenly, with some regions adapting while others fractured suddenly. The storyteller notes how endings rarely resemble dramatic finales, instead arriving as exhaustion when repair feels impossible. Former allies reconsidered loyalty, prioritizing survival over sentiment. The First Empire's structures remained standing even as authority evaporated within them. The Second Empire retained rituals long after power faded, creating a haunting contrast between appearance and reality. Ordinary people navigated change with resilience, preserving culture even as political frameworks dissolved. The story moves forward, not toward a single moment, but toward overlapping endings shaped by long-term choices. What remains is not silence, but transformation as new powers learn from ruins while repeating familiar patterns. History, ever patient, prepares the ground for beginnings that rise from collapse, carrying echoes of both caution and possibility.